Do you have a double consciousness? And if you do, what are the pros and cons of this double consciousness? That's what we're going to get into in today's podcast of the 4Q podcast. Okay, so what is a double consciousness? A double consciousness is a term described by W.E.BDubois, who was a sociologist and the first black man to ever have a PhD from Harvard University. And he coined this term around when you are part of an underprivileged group or a minority group, or you're not in the dominant group who has power at the time, you have what's called a double consciousness. So if you're a female in our society, you've got this. If you're a female leader, entrepreneur, or content creator, you've got this because we all are in a patriarchal society. If you are LGBTIQ plus A community, if you are a person of color, if you're able-bodied or, not able-bodied, or if you're from the neurodivergent community, whatever you are, if you're not in the community that has the dominant discourse or the dominance in our society or the power, you will have a double consciousness. And this term talks about people who are privileged. Let's say a very common example is people who have white privilege, for example. They oftentimes don't see the issues that people of colour have to deal with. And so they're very oblivious to it, and they're only sort of aware of how society and how their lives function from the perspective of someone who has privilege, who doesn't have to face the issues that person of colour does. So they have a singular consciousness, whereas a person of colour, they not only understand the struggles that they've had to deal with and how things haven't always been stacked in their favour and things that they've had to overcome and socioeconomic issues and all of that, but they can also see the singular consciousness. They can see the benefits and how someone from a privileged background gets to live and gets to work. So they get to see both the privileged or powerful side as well as understanding the non-privileged and non-power side. They understand both sides, hence the double consciousness, which makes them have sort of an edge in terms of they can talk to both demographics, whereas it's very hard from a position of power to really relate to someone who has no privilege or has no power. If you're a female, so, at Savasana Collective, our practice, we specialize in working with people who identify as female and have anxiety, stress, burnout, or relationship issues, and particularly female entrepreneurs, content creators, and female leaders. These women absolutely have double consciousness because we're in a patriarchal society. A lot of us don't even realize that we are. You kind of go, it's hard to understand what that concept means, but business models, work-life balance, motherhood and working, all of that and how it was created and what that looks like today has been created by men. It's been based on research that was purely done with men. It was based on what men's needs were. It was based on research conducted by male professors, male academics. So for a long time, most academics at the top, PhDs, the people conducting research, were men. Even in the psychology field that I'm in social work, a lot of the research that was done in the psychology world, right up until 50s, 60s, 70s, even 80s, all the participants were men. There was not a female perspective. Our businesses that have been set up today have based on marketing principles and business setups principles that were based when only men were going to work, and there wasn't an expectation to have a business that supports men who have babies and have to, do the things that we do, which is breastfeeding or trying to balance that or balance the house chores. When men went to work, that's all they did. They just work. So there wasn't a balance or creation about what we have to do, which is balance working plus the home chores plus the child rearing plus the looking perfect and all of that. And so for us, we understand not always the full extent of it, but what it's like to not have the power or the privilege and try to balance so much. We have this double consciousness of how men have just had it easier for a while. They don't think they have, and they might not realize how it's worked in their favor, but that's the double consciousness. Now, the pros and cons of this, the pros are, particularly for female leaders and things like that, is that we understand their perspective, and we understand that for us to get ahead, there's certain things we need to put in place, and there's certain things that we need to educate people on. But the cons of it are that we understand that sometimes, by no choice of our own, if you're in an underprivileged group or a minority of some kind, that if you want to get ahead, you have to play by some of the rules of the game that the people in power or privilege have. For example, a lot of female leaders will not be emotional. They try their best not to show any kind of emotion in the workplace because they feel like their male counterparts would never, and they also feel like it somehow diminishes their authority as a female leader. I remember being told, don't bring food to the office. And I sort of said, why? Like when I started a new job, I like to sort of share food. Food is love. I'm a gift giver. So I like to sort of be able to share and give and, boost people up like that, coffees or food or whatever. And it was basically this idea of like, no, a man would never do that. So why would you do that? That's just diminishing you. It makes you a bit housewifey, really, which is nothing wrong with being housewifey to begin with. But that was sort of the messaging that I was receiving in a couple of jobs from, senior people to me, which came from their double consciousness. They were actually correct in some ways, which is such a shame. So there's this idea that we have to fit into other people's molds to get ahead. So it's the analogy I sometimes like to think of is that, in Game of Thrones, Khaleesi, the queen, she talks about breaking the systems that have always been, breaking the wheel. But first, she needs to be the head of the wheel. And that's sometimes what can happen, is that female leaders can break the mold of how we're meant to be, how we're meant to do work around kids and families, and how we can be successful leaders and demand respect without having to have a traditional masculine or male authoritative perspective. But sometimes we have to play the game of that to get to that position. And then once we're there, we can change it, which is such a shame. But the double consciousness allows you to play both games, which is such a shame that we should have to do that in, these 2020s that we're in. But it's just something to be aware of, and something that I want you to think about. How have you had to mold yourself to fit into other people's ideas and other people's perspectives? It's not great, but as females, we do this all the time. And so sometimes my work is sort of letting people think about, if that wasn't the case, how would you be? If you weren't always worrying about what the majority thought, how would you run a business? Would you allow people to have work from home so they can be flexible with the kids? Would you pay extra money so there could be a daycare within the workplace or a creche? Or what kinds of workplaces would you create? Would you encourage, food to be brought in, or, to be empathetic and emotional and strong. You can absolutely be strong and cry at work. There's sort of this expectation of, oh my gosh, what's everybody going to think of me? I cracked and I was human for a moment. So this is just your reminder that there's pros and cons to being aware of the double consciousness, but I want you to start to think about, how are you changing for other people and for the dominant perspective? And how can you change it? How can you educate people who have that singular consciousness to be aware of what you're going through? And how can you use that double consciousness to your advantage so you can break the wheel or change the wheel? As a social worker and a therapist and someone with a psychology background as well, that's one of our things, is we work between systems to quote unquote get shit done. as females and as people, as a woman of color as well as myself, we've had to figure out how to do that coming through the 90s, which was an interesting time, and the 2000s, so I'd love for you to think about that. Think about, if the world could be done in your way, what would that look like? And how can you educate people to live more in alignment with what you value and how you believe that the world could be better and how you believe the world could change? All right, I hope that you got something out of today. If you love today's episode, please let me know. Get in touch. I will put some notes in about the double consciousness. And again, just a side note, the double consciousness happens for socioeconomic. I missed that at the beginning, saying that clearly, but if you're from a non-privileged background in terms of finances, you absolutely can see both sides of that equation as well, and how society is very much built for wealthy people and not for the middle or lower classes. So, all right, you take care. I'm so happy to share today with you in this time. Get in touch if you loved it. Email me, message me on Instagram, and I will see you next week for another episode of the 4Q podcast. Bye for now.